All right, we ready? Yes. All right, greetings everyone. Thanks so much for showing up today. You're coming to the 6th EXALT Dialogue, which is a special offshoot of the EXALT Initiative, which is the Global Extractivisms and Alternatives Initiative, which is dedicated to really exploring the idea of extractivism and pretty much all the manifestations that it takes place. And the EXALT Dialogue series is specifically really trying to open up a space to, really for people who are interested and self-interested to come together and to be able to talk about these issues. And it really tries to be this kind of low maintenance kind of meetup where we can do a call, we can come together and we can actually learn and just ultimately have dialogue with each other and hear about issues and topics that are dear to our hearts. So today we have a lovely presentation organized by Mira, who will, I guess I'll hand the floor over to, who will kind of explain our guests today and what's going on. And again, just want to say and give a shout out though. Thanks for everyone showing up. Mira, thanks so much for organizing this. Vanessa, Keith, everyone coming here. And especially to Barry, Marcus, and Anya for kind of holding together and keeping the EXALT initiative in place. And so with that, Mira, I pass it on to you.
Okay, thank you. And good evening from Canberra, Australia. It's a bit late here already, but good to see you all. And yeah, so I'm Mira Kaikkonen, part of the EXALT community and currently a research fellow with the Resources, Environment and Development Group at the Australian National University. And just starting with a project called Volatile Rivers and Infrastructure Politics in the Mekong region, funded by the Australian Research Council. And I've carried out research on political ecology of water and climate change, especially and hydropower for some time now. And I remember when I was going or doing fieldwork on dams in southwest of Cambodia in the Cardamoms in 2014 and interviewing people on dam effects. And that time we're only starting to materialize, and what people actually most urgently wanted to talk about was sand mining, which was that time most concretely damaging their riverine and coastal livelihoods in terms of fishing and crabbing crowns. And that sand was mainly going to Singapore, used as infill for Singapore's territorial expansion. And recently, sand mining has intensified along the Mekong River and many rivers in the world, but Mekong River being one of them. And in Cambodia, where I worked, there's a huge domestic demand now driving it. And the sand is used, for example, to fill in lakes and wetlands for speculative luxury real estate projects, often involving Chinese investors. For a long time in Mekong, in many rivers, the attention when extraction or extractive affairs are being discussed, the attention often is in hydropower. And of course there's a kind of new boom of hydropower going on and very severe implications on riverine livelihoods, fisheries, biodiversity, and so on. And of course it deserves all the attention and would deserve even more of it, I think. But at the same time, there has been a surge of this more dispersed, more decentralized and much less capital intensive and much more often, at least in Cambodia, more domestic extractive affair that, for example, in Cambodia involves local tycoons and it's very much enmeshed with domestic elite patronage deals and so on. And unlike with dams, much less is known on the magnitude and their effects. There's not really similar kind of impact assessment processes that anyway with dams as well, those impact assessment processes are pretty flawed, but there's even less of them involved in sand mining. And but we do know that sand mining really adds to the extractive pressure on Mekong, but also other rivers globally. And it destroys habitats and causes riverbank erosion, for example. And also there's the side of the sand infill, for example, in Cambodia, that destroys wetlands and wetland-based livelihoods and causes evictions and urban floods as the lakes and the wetlands are being filled and so on. And at the same time, the sand mining aggravates the sediment effects of large dams that already trap huge amounts of sediments, and those effects are pretty severe as well, and diverse. Disruptions of nutrient transports and detrimental impacts on fisheries and fish agricultural productivity and riverbank erosion, and also in Mekong, it's sinking and shrinking of the Mekong Delta, which is the third largest delta in the world. So when trying to understand what is happening to the rivers and to Mekong, but other rivers as well, I think it would be a good thing to kind of bring together the discussions on dams and sand mining more effectively. But today the focus is more on sand mining, but I think keeping in mind the disruptions on hydrosocial relations and riverine livelihoods as well. And I guess there is another gap to fill in with this event as well, is that in broader discussions on extractivism, there's been a lot of focus on other minerals, hydrocarbons, energy minerals, and gemstones, etc., which have kind of like overshadowed materials such as sand. And there's been, I can see also in the audience, authors who have been kind of highlighting this, how sand has been a kind of neglected mineral or resource. But I guess the third point now is that, well, now there is more attention, and the sand demand is kind of increasing, and the sand mining has kind of moved more from the shadows to the spotlight, and there's quite a lot of international media attention and also emerging scholarly literature. Much of it has been kind of having a global approach, but then there has been an emerging body of studies on dispossessive livelihood effects, and more situated ones, and situated vulnerabilities, and the kind of more local power dynamics, as well as the kind of local global connections. And I think our speaker today, Vanessa Lamb, has been at the forefront, a kind of pioneer in this kind of body of research, and we are very happy to have you here today. And Vanessa has looked at sand extraction from kind of multi-scale perspective, and studied carefully also the livelihood effects, for example, in the Salween Basin in Myanmar. And more recently has also raised criticism on how the current emergent kind of sand crisis narrative has been framed, and what are the possible omissions and the effects of these omissions, and so on. So I think after your talk, Vanessa, we'll know much more about this phenomena of sand mining and its implications, as well as how we could possibly frame or reframe it more meaningfully, or the sand crisis narrative as well, and how to make sense of that. So maybe a few more words about Vanessa. Is an associate professor in the Department of Social Science at York University, a geographer who has studied environmental change, political change as well in the mainland Southeast Asia, with especially focus on the Salween River Basin in Myanmar. And after Vanessa's talk, we'll have invited comments from Keith Barney. I don't know whether I would introduce you or now already. Well, Keith is an associate professor at the Crawford School's Resources, Environment and Development Group, where I'm also a fellow now, at the Australian National University, and also a geographer, and has worked extensively on resource politics and state formation and various forms of extractivism in Southeast Asia, particularly in Laos, where Keith has worked, for example, on hydropower dams and industrial plantations, forestry projects, etc. But now that is a bit long already, so I'll hand over to Vanessa, and it's the next 40 minutes are yours.
Thanks, Mira, and thanks for the invitation, and thanks, Keith, for the eventual discussing. I just want to share this. Sorry. Can I get a thumbs up? You can see the slides, but not my notes. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
All good.
So I'm really happy to be here, and before I begin, I just want to acknowledge I'm speaking to you from Toronto. This city was established on the lands of many Indigenous First Nations, including the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And there are a range of important river systems here that flow through and below the city. And I just want to acknowledge and pay respect to the elders, traditional owners, before I begin. And the research I'm sharing with you today is focusing on rivers, political ecology, and environmental change, mainly in Southeast Asia. And this work began more than 15 years ago. I started working for an organization based in Bangkok, Thailand called Terra. And I was working on the magazine Watershed, a People's Forum on Ecology, which was telling important but overlooked stories around environmental justice in the region. That's how I sort of came to do a lot of this work on rivers in Southeast Asia. And I think that's also how I met Mira and Keith, but I might be wrong. Since that time, I've continued to do research on rivers. And one aspect that I've been looking at most recently are the ways that rivers and their values, their relationships, as well as the control and extraction are about more than flows of water. So I'm going to share with you a paper in progress on river sand, these disrupted hydrosocial relations, and the emergent environmental crisis of sand mining. And I'm going to share with you some of my specific field work. So I have published on some of this already. I know that there's some people here in the audience who might have already be familiar with my critique of crisis, as Mira mentioned. Some of the newer work that I'm trying to bring out today is focusing on some of the overlooked aspects of the sand economy and struggles to make a living from what has been declared a disappearing resource. And I think more foundationally, this work for me is about how we understand the relationships between people, the state, nature, and struggles to make a living in what is an increasingly difficult context. So the media has deemed the sand crisis, the global environmental crisis you probably never heard of. And I think that's because the never heard of part is because sand, while it might be essential to our lives, is not something we like see and feel on a daily basis. I mean, it is important in the sense that it's essential for making roads, buildings, and electronics, but we depend on it even though it's not necessarily visible to us. But increasingly, this is becoming visible and its impacts are becoming visible in sites of extraction around the world. So the crisis part refers to the negative impacts from the mining or extraction of sand from natural sources like rivers and coasts, which are particularly in rural and indigenous landscapes for use in construction and fill in cities. And these negative impacts on people's livelihoods and ecosystems are a part of what this crisis refers to. The other part of the crisis is that while it might be impossible or seem impossible to run out of sand, the UN Environment Program has declared sand as a rare or scarce resource as of 2014. So these are part of what this crisis refers to, but I think there's, a lot more to it. And when I started looking a bit closer, a number of knowledge gaps emerged in relationship to both the research and the advocacy on sand and sand mining and the sand crisis. And of course, I just want to note, I think the impacts of sand mining and its rise are very significant and important to study from a range of fields. But I just do want to note some of these gaps to start. So there's a number of gaps in data availability, and I'll discuss some of these examples today. But this raises questions about how we can make claims about rarity or scarcity in an environmental crisis that's important to consider in relationship to what we know. Second, scholars who have been working on the sand crisis and the impacts of sand mining have already noted a narrowing of field, so a lack of critical social science engagement. And reviews of existing work have pointed out how much of this work that does exist on sand and sand mining really focuses on ecological or economic dimensions, which are more narrowly defined. And I think this is important, not just because it's great to have more research on this important topic, but because, social scientists like political ecologists and geographers have provided important insights into how crises or emergencies, how they are presented or framed, with what methods, and this has a range of effects and can shape how a crisis unfolds. including issues around who is included, who's an agent, how, and at what scales. Sometimes a narrowing of a frame around a resource can also pose a problem for understanding the impacts of extraction and the range of relationships and potential alternatives that might already exist or exist in the future. And in the case of sand, we see the indirect impacts, for instance, of sand extraction are often unaccounted for in assessments or studies, and they're also difficult to account for, such as how sand extraction downstream might impact fisheries upstream, or how that might be disaggregated from other range of impacts like climate change or other sorts of developments. In addition, in many places, small-scale sand extraction itself is also a subsistence activity that could be displaced from larger operations. So sort of identifying these range of impacts can be difficult, and I would say needs some additional work. Even in cases where sand mining is directly impacting livelihoods of those who are like dependent on, for instance, the site of extraction, like river or mangrove sands, the links between sand and subsistence or even semi-subsistence economies are really not sort of evaluated or accounted for. So they're usually sort of overlooked or put in a separate box. And I think I'm just referring to Catherine Gibson. She's a kind of famous geographer who's worked on a range of issues, and maybe potentially most favorite for her work with Gibson Graham in thinking about the diverse economy. But one of the things she said recently about crisis has really stuck with me. She says, we can't fold everything into one crisis narrative. And I think what I'm concerned with are the sort of flattening of what could be a potential range of different relationships, hydrosocial relationships and so forth in the construction of the sand crisis, and these sort of the way these gaps are shaping that. And I would say at present, we're certainly experiencing multiple or overlapping crises, and there's a real wealth of work right now that seeks to understand the impacts and implications of crisis, particularly in geography. And I just want to highlight a recent paper from Progress in Human Geography that outlines what environmental crisis and the climate emergency framing does. So for instance, Anderson and colleagues show how crises mark an opportunity of sorts for governing and governance. So emergency as technique for the state to make claims and to take action. And they write that through governing through emergencies is simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary, and can introduce a set of governmental techniques and functions to sustain a particular type of rule. In other words, Anderson and colleagues argue that even if crisis has the potential to be generative and open up new pathways, it also tends to essentially reinforce the status quo, extending governance and authority over resources and decision-making, and pushing for urgent action needing to be taken by state and elites, rather than asking like what kind of governance is needed or what kind of economy or economic decisions we want. And in my work on sand, I think this has raised important questions. There are pressing questions about what the current crisis framing accomplishes, who the crisis is for, at what scales, and by whose metrics. And I also have questions about what other opportunities have arisen in crisis, for whom, and who is sort of excluded. So one of the key highlights from Anderson and colleagues' paper is that Indigenous peoples and racialized communities and their longstanding struggles are often overlooked in conventional framings of, for instance, the climate crisis. The key point here are the ways that certain actors can mobilize, for instance, time and urgency to include some voices and obscure others. And I think we also see this in the sand crisis. So I'm going to outline a bit more about the crisis as it's been presented and focus on my own research in Southeast Asia and present some further critique. So the sand industry is pretty big business. Globally, there are estimates that range between 1.7 billion and 70 billion US annually. The exact numbers can be hard to discern because there are a range of actors involved in excavating and moving sand. And while sometimes this involves state authorities, much of it is also illicit or informal, so unaccounted for. what is all this sand being extracted for? Well, sand is really what cities are made of, and I can't really underline enough how much we rely on sand, even if we aren't aware of it. It's not only for construction and fill, it's used for glass, right? It's the minerals that are extracted for electronic devices. And this sand extraction is impacting resource-based livelihoods and environmental change around the world. And despite this really being described for about 10 years now as a crisis, there has been calls for more research on this topic even to today. And I say that like some would claim that there's limited research on this topic compared to other extractives, which is probably true. But I see that sort of changing. So there's a lot of work by, for instance, my colleagues. Some of them are here today: Melissa Marshka, Chris Hackney, Meta, I think, is here today, Aurora Torres. But one sort of gap that sort of has stuck with me is that while you might believe that declaring a crisis of resource depletion would require, for instance, data on amounts of sand extraction and use, and like to put that within a context, while we do have estimates, there are a lot of holes or gaps in that basic data. And so I just want to give you an example from where I work in Southeast Asia and how it's emerged as a hotspot for sand mining. So, sorry, my throat is a little dry. So focusing on Southeast Asia, specifically, I work in mainland Southeast Asia mostly, where there's a host of major river systems that have made it a prime spot for sand mining. I've studied several of these systems, but I'm going to focus today on the Salaween River, which is where I've done most of my work, shown here on the map. The Salaween is a river that starts up in the Himalayas, flows through China, Myanmar, also Burma and Thailand, and generally is accepted to provide like large amounts of subsistence and semi-subsistence livelihood support for an estimated 10 million people throughout the basin. And on the Salaween, there are a range of extractive activities ongoing. So for instance, there are 13 proposed dams on the whole system, I think 7 on the mainstream, and 1 water diversion proposed. Also ongoing extraction of sand. And there are a range of other activities as well that are happening. And there are a range of livelihood activities, for instance, that account for that support for 10 million people. This includes seasonal activities like riverbank gardening, fishing, even small scale sand extraction. And these are really related to the seasonal flows that would be impacted by hydropower developments and are currently being impacted by sand mining. And as many of you know here, even anticipated infrastructures can have effects in the present. So there are also a range of ways that these like 13 planned dams are also having different impacts in sites of proposal in terms of construction and so forth. But the main point is that there's a lot going on in this system, a lot of proposed development and extractions. And I'm just going to focus on this aspect, but that doesn't mean that I don't recognize that there's a whole range of other integrated impacts. So if we look at the demand for sand, for instance, so where is all this sand going to in the region? Singapore is basically the major importer of sand, not just in the region, but per capita in many years has the largest import amounts according to their own figures. And they are primarily using sand and gravels for building the city-state up and out. One of the biggest projects right now is Singapore's territorial expansion, and sand is being used for fill. So the expansion, which Singapore defines not as expansion, but as reclamation, so literally pushing the water away to reclaim the land that's beneath, started when they gained independence in '65. And since that time, Singapore's land area has increased by over 20% and is set to continue by 2030. They will have a growth of 30%. And initially where I work along the Salaween in Myanmar, it wasn't part of this picture. So sand was imported from nearby Indonesia and Malaysia. But when both these countries either banned or limited exports, the trade moved, for instance, to Cambodia, Myanmar, the Philippines, and Vietnam. And you can see here on this graph that sand is being shipped and traded in huge quantities, but there's also some gaps. So if you look at the difference in what Singapore reports it receives to what Myanmar and Cambodia report that they send, you'll notice some discrepancies, which is around export amounts and import amounts. So the gap between, for instance, Myanmar and Singapore is about 25 to 26 million tons, or Singapore reporting 12 times the amount of sand that they get from Myanmar that Myanmar reports that they send. And if you look at the contrast in Cambodia, the numbers, the discrepancy is even larger. So there's some information missing in that picture. In addition, we know very little about the sand and gravel extraction in specific places. So one example of this sort of gap is that while we do have general estimates of what domestic extraction amounts might look like, for instance, it's often correlated to like cement use. We have no data available on sand extraction by site or by basin. And so I'm concerned about this lack of data and, claims around scarcity and extraction and like increases and so forth linked to physical amounts. But it's not maybe my primary concern. It's just a really good example of some of the limited data availability. I think part of, though, the issue with data availability is linked to lack of information about key actors in the sand trade. So for instance, in my own research, I identified one of the key companies, Star High, a Myanmar Singaporean firm, which does both sand extraction and shipping from Myanmar to Singapore. But most of this work is not publicly available, and it requires primary field work to really tease this out, which is increasingly difficult, particularly in Myanmar. Also, it's not always visible that there are competing interests for sand and sand flows in river systems. So for instance, in my case, dams and dam developers who want to sort of harness the free-flowing river for hydropower are playing a key role in decisions about sand allocation, because when a dam is built, sand is blocked, which means that the flow has changed. So that can be a boon for some upstream of the dam and a loss for others downstream. We also have international environmental NGOs playing a role, and the media as well. And I think these groups have really done a good job of calling attention to the problem and the crisis. In fact, the work on the UN commodity trade data gaps was originally presented years ago by the NGO Global Witness, focusing on the situation in Cambodia. Today, though, many organizations are pushing governments to act to avoid or avert a looming sand crisis. This is exemplified in a 2022 UNEP report that I just put on the slide, titled Sand and Sustainability, 10 Strategic Recommendations to Avert a Crisis. And they provide specific steps for governments to take to avert this new or impending global crisis. And one issue that I wanted to point out within this work that I would appreciate feedback on, I've been thinking about this for a while, is that in this work on crisis through the media and with environmental NGOs, there's been a lot of focus on loss and leaving. People who have lived along major river systems like the Salween, but really also the Mekong, are shown as picking up and leaving resource-based livelihoods and migrating elsewhere because of sand extraction. And I think what my work shows is that this is more complex, and I wanted to flag that I have concerns about the implications of making direct links between sand mining and, for instance, out-migration and the construction of this crisis. So I think there are important questions about migration in terms of who is actually moving or migrating, what are they leaving, why them and not others, that need to be addressed. But it's not as clear to me that there are these direct impacts on out-migration. And so these data gaps and discrepancies that I presented here in the crisis are examples of a number of concerns I have with the construction of crisis and the way that it's played out and what information we have and don't have. And when I've thought about really what's being missed here, or what else I would like to see, or what's the role of sand, for instance, outside of these kind of frames that have been set up in crisis, this really has me turning to the riverbank gardens that also require these sands. They're planted on sandy riverbanks and alluvial islands, and they're really common throughout the region and other parts of the world as well. But to try to explain these gardens, if you're not familiar, I created an annual timeline here on the slide, and this is from interviews with gardeners as well as like my own field work, participatory observation, and also drawing on, local knowledge documentation. But in doing so, I really just want to illustrate how essential seasonality and flows of sand and water are to this sort of livelihood activity. So to outline this, the monsoon flooding, which runs roughly June to September, are when the banks are sort of inundated with fertile sands and soils. And then throughout the year, the water recedes, allowing farmers to plant and garden on the floodplain, the river's banks, and alluvial islands. And the crops that are produced here are a range of vegetables, tomatoes, peanuts, other local vegetables, and they're sold at markets, but also used for subsistence activities. But we know very little about these gardens, which rely on the same sands and flows as sand mining. So riverbank gardens, I would say, have been overlooked in contemporary surveys, maps, and urban planning. And at present, there's no systemic study or estimates available for the number of people who depend on these gardens in Southeast Asia or what these practices entail. And more specifically, where I work in Myanmar and the Salaween, there's a real lack of research in terms of how these gardens function and their significance. So just as an example of the available information on riverbank gardening, the 2019 state-of-the-art baseline assessment of rivers in Myanmar includes the following summary. Riverbank gardens can be substantial. However, there are no available estimates of their likely extent. So I've had residents suggest to me that part of the reason for this oversight is potentially that many researchers and consultants come at just one point of the year, thus missing the gardens and their dynamics entirely. I think that's certainly part of it, and it speaks to some broader questions I have about how we might understand crisis and change within this context. So what I want to do next is I'm just going to introduce a couple of key ideas, and then I'm going to share with you some of my work on these gardens. So in order to think critically about the values of sand and the implications of crisis, I've looked at work critiquing crisis that I introduced at the start, but I'm also drawing on work on diverse economies and political ecology. And I'm not going to go into too much detail today, but I'm happy to answer questions. But I think it's key to draw on this range of critical work because it brings out, I think, important nuance and complexity within this context. It can also expand who is involved and who benefits from crisis and who is impacted. And I've got Gribbs and Graham's glacier image on the slide here. This is just a reminder of what's typically missed in our understandings of the economy and how much of what's missed is actually key to well-being and survival. And one point I wanted to flag is that they do discuss gardening livelihoods as one key point of the diverse economy, as well as a great example of the care economy. And in the case of sand, as I'll show, it is definitely key to the provision of food and sustenance for individuals, families, communities, and even social movements. And I think it's really easy to overlook this in simplistic illustrations of, for instance, crisis that might narrowly frame the economy of sand, for instance, solely focused on, let's say, like direct negative impacts of sand mining, whether they be environmental or trying to make claims about migration. And so I'm just introducing this here to think about this as I walk through some of my research findings. Whoops. So to ground this a bit, I'm focusing just on one site, but I've been conducting research along the Salaween in both Thailand and Myanmar for about 2 decades now. And the site I'm going to focus on is Pa'an, which is located on the Salaween River. It's in Karen State, Myanmar, also known as Burma. And I do want to mention that this research has not only been conducted over time, so over a number of years, but also not just in one season, but like in many instances across different seasons within the year. And I also want to note that for those familiar with this region, this is obviously an increasingly complicated and difficult political context. since 2020 specifically. So this is not only linked to COVID-19 sort of shutdown of borders and mobilities in this area, but also in 2021, February, Myanmar had a military coup that ended a decade of more open semi-democratic rule. And so what this has meant for my work is that it's really underlined the value of longstanding fieldwork and relationships to continue to do research. And in some cases, it's also necessitated moving online. And as I focus on Pa'an, it's a provincial capital of around 500,000 people. It's sited again along the Salaween River. To me, it feels more like one of those Dakota city towns, a mix of urban and rural. Is located near to the political border with Thailand. And Karen State, where it's located as a provincial capital, is also home to the Salaween Peace Park, which is a conservation area that is led by Indigenous Karen residents in collaboration with a range of actors. And my research here included interviews and personal histories with regular field visits from 2017 to 2020. And then during that period, it had more than 75 semi-structured interviews and 50 personal histories with residents along the river. And since then, I've been mostly doing online work in Myanmar, which includes interviews. And some of this work is being done by myself. I can speak Thai and some Karen, some other languages, but some is done with the help of a Burmese-speaking research assistant. So to illustrate what I hope are wider themes in the analysis of this work, the interviews and the personal histories, I'm going to just introduce two sort of personal histories from that work that are meant to encapsulate these broader themes. And I'm using this approach to highlight what I see as a need for more nuance and complexity, and highlight the experience of the interviewees linked to sort of rethinking who we hear or who we're hearing from in crisis. So the first story is from Mr. A, and he's 50 and he has a family of 8. And I wanted to include his story as an example of the complexity of identifying what I see as direct impacts of sand mining. So for instance, direct impacts of sand mining on migration in the region, and also how people are responding locally. So in Pa'an, it was clear that sand mining operations were like in direct competition with residents for the use of sand, especially the riverbank gardeners, but also those who are fishing. For riverbank gardeners, some described, like Mr. A, the banks that they've relied on for gardening as unexpected falling off into the river at astounding rates and amounts that they hadn't seen before. And these sand mining operations are increasing in number and scope, and in many ways, they are sort of limiting the possibilities for riverbank and alluvial agriculture now and in the future. Some, like Mr. A, who have done informal sand and gravel mining here in the past, are also no longer able to do this. Mr. A's family has lost land along the river due to erosion. So this includes lost livelihood opportunities like the gardens he used for vegetable cultivation, but it also included the land where his home was. And he saw this as directly linked to the new sand mining operations on the Salaween that were, removing the same sands that he used or relied on. So for Mr. A, this means that, sand mining has impacted his ability to make a living, and he even became homeless and landless in Pa'an as a result. But he explained that this wasn't the first time that he was in this situation. He's not from Pa'an, he's from central Myanmar, the Irrawaddy region. He settled in Pa'an about 20 years ago as a domestic migrant. So he actually tried to go to Thailand as a migrant worker, but he couldn't afford to be a transnational migrant, and he didn't make it across the border and ended up in Pa'an. In Mr. A's own telling, though, he framed this personal history not around his failure to migrate across the border, but the success of his son, who is now living and working in Bangkok. And what I just want to highlight with this short migration trajectory is that while sand mining has certainly contributed to Mr. A's current situation, it's exacerbating housing vulnerability and played a role in getting his son to Bangkok because, for instance, he didn't see a future in Pa'an without access to this land. There's a longer migration trajectory here. I think that's worth attending to, and suggesting that sand mining is responsible for migration in this context, even though I would be very happy with saying that it plays a key role. I think tends to overlook the range of historical and structural factors that shape these complex decisions. I think it also plays into misconceptions about sedentarization in the region, but maybe that's another conversation. On my recent trip to Pa'an, it was 2019 when I actually was able to be there in person. A local sand mining ban had been implemented around Pa'an. So in like the city, the visible area, there was no longer an option to do sand mining. And Mr. A was really happy about this, but others were actually still calling for a wholesale ban on the river because, local bans won't work. The, operations just move upstream or downstream. And they were organizing a riverbank committee to express their concerns to officials. And I didn't hear them use any words like crisis or anything, but I do think that, the international attention around these issues is part of what can help them facilitate local action. So I could see them sort of using this as a way to get action taken on some of this work. The second story that I wanted to share with you is from Mr. and Mrs. Jha, who are Karen. And they're a couple who are in their 20s. They're riverbank gardening in Pa'an, but they also weren't originally from Pa'an. They had left nearby Mon State to come here for a livelihood opportunity. Mr. Jha's father was a fisher. He didn't own any land, and it was not seen as a way to make a living for his sons going forward. So Mr. Jha and Mrs. Jha moved to Pa'an. And since they were new to riverbank gardening, it wasn't something they'd been doing over generations. Mrs. Jha said that they learned how to manage the sand and the land by acquiring skills, first as hired workers, on other people's plots, and then eventually they were able to save up to get their own plot of riverbank land and even an alluvial island. Let's see if I can get this to work. On the slide is a time lapse along the Salween, and it just illustrates how dynamic the river system is and how dynamic floodplain cultivation would be here. You can see the river's bank change and islands pop up at different sites across the years. And I'm highlighting this one because it's interesting to look at those sand flows, but also because I think it highlights how active a sort of cultivation strategy this is in terms of riverbank gardening. Their management is complex and it requires a really active strategy for cultivation and management. And these would obviously be impacted by large-scale sand mining operations because sand is really important here. Not only because that's literally the ground, the fertile sediments that are being planted on, but also because the flows and the seasonality and the timing are also key to gardening. So just like other agriculturalists or gardeners that I interviewed, Mr. and Mrs. Jha identified that sand extraction was a major problem for them and was putting their land and housing that they had worked for potentially in jeopardy. But very much like the story of Mr. A, Mr. Jha also had a story of migration that pointed to a much longer trajectory. And I think really for him, I'm just going to summarize this complex story, but there's a lot of conflict in this region. And so Mr. Jha and his father and his grandfather, their livelihoods have all been impacted by conflict, and they've had to manage to flee fighting throughout the years. And this has really impacted their ability to choose a livelihood or make migration decisions. And Mr. Jha told me that as part of his longer history prior to being fishers, his grandfather actually lived in Karen State near Pa'an, where he had owned a rice factory. But his grandfather had landed in Mon State nearby and where Mr. Jha had moved from in order to flee fighting. And then Mr. Jha ended up moving back to Pa'an to find new opportunities. So there's this sort of internal circular migration. And of course, we know that conflict shapes migration and the ability to make a living, but it's also increased, the number of people fleeing abroad into IDP camps. But in the Jha's case, which I think is really common in this area, they instead moved to nearby areas, fleeing conflict, but finding new ways to make a living. And for the Jha's, then their move to Pa'an was both a consequence of longer-term conflict and their family's lack of land and capital in Mon State. They found this new opportunity to make a living, and now that is being challenged by sand mining. Mrs. Jha also explained that production of vegetables was really important to be able to support religious and cultural ceremonies. So we discussed their younger son's recent ordination and how they were able to contribute and come together with others at the temple around the vegetables they could provide. I'm happy to discuss this in more detail, but even the specific vegetables that are used in ceremonies are many times different than what's produced from market. So you have local seeds rather than, for instance, imported seeds, which we used for those being sold. So they're bigger and last longer. Women are also primarily responsible for bringing vegetables to market and for food preparation and cooking. And I think this is an important part of the work that is linked to household livelihood strategies and decision-making. And I think in this context where there's also historical displacement and conflict and a lack of sort of access to state infrastructure and resources, these relationships and like diverse economies around food and agriculture production are significant for reasons that extend beyond like the material or economic benefits narrowly defined. So for example, many women also participate in providing or preparing food for social movement actions like protests against sand mining, even if they themselves may not participate in these higher profile activities or political actions. And these relationships of care and responsibility are a key aspect to well-being and survival and living well. And they also, of course, would impact sort of household decision-making around migration and choosing which livelihood activities you focus on. And so while there are a range of reasons that people do riverbank gardening, you know, the flexibility, the economic benefits, and so on, I was told by many that this is a key contribution of riverbank gardening. These interpersonal relationships around the gardens and the food that they produce are really key, I think, to understanding the values of sand here, the sand economy, and to decision-making around livelihoods and migration. So in my attempt to sort of bring these stories together, I think, you know, frames of crisis that I started with can really give primacy to urgency, as well as specific economic or environmental frames that would necessitate like direct action. And that's important, but they also tend to like flatten or obscure, for instance, sort of socially embedded concerns or in the case of sand, I'm attempting to bring out a bit more of this complexity and nuance through some of this work with local resource use and gardening to highlight some of these multiple values and uses of sand. And I just want to say again, I am concerned about the impacts of sand mining on people and rivers and, you know, what appears to be gaps in data for this new environmental crisis. But I'm also concerned about what this sort of current framing of crisis is accomplishing. So in terms of what I am concerned about, I think, as I noted at the start, you know, I am concerned that existing research has tended to narrowly focus on the more environmental or economic impacts of sand migration on rivers. Yet, like in my research, and I hope I showed you some of these aspects in these personal histories, you know, sand is really important to a range of livelihood activities, from gardening and food production to even local sand and gravel extraction that would be impacted. And at the same time, migration and mobility were key to these personal histories and to like livelihood decision making. The personal histories also highlight how there are multiple factors that could influence livelihood and migration decisions, including conflict, intergenerational livelihood strategies, dynamic political and economic context, as well as environmental change and degradation. And I think for this reason, it's really difficult to make or attribute, you know, migration or livelihood change to a single cause in this context, such as sand extraction or a sand crisis. And one way to think about it is if we moved, you know, sand extraction from this site, you know, what decisions would be different? And I still think that these decisions around migration and livelihood would be really complex, right? People are losing their land for a range of reasons. And I think here decades of local conflict and a dynamic political economic contest are really shaping this decision-making process, underlining a range of choices that people have. And second, I think the work by local riverbank gardeners shows not only does extracting sand impact or shape ecologies and impact rivers and livelihoods, but the sand economy is also like grounded and shaped by people's actions, decisions, and relationships. So the sand economy, for instance, can be shaped by the actions of local gardeners or even local municipal authorities to take actions, for instance, to ban sand mining. And I think this is linked to individual and community relationships that can support survival and living well in spite of what might be difficult conditions. And taking a step back to speak to environmental crisis and the crisis framing, I mean by highlighting these complex and diverse economies of sand within a specific context, I really aim to show how there are a range of responses to sand mining. So this includes, for instance, remaining and resisting, engaging in local forms of management and governance, or even using the language of crisis to speak back to authorities to make change. So while I noted there are a number of more technical questions I have with the construction of environmental crises, I think my main concern here is really that the sand crisis has tended to overlook what are these complex hydrosocial relationships and decision-making around, for instance, migration and livelihood decisions. And at another level, it really raises questions about who can speak and act when a crisis is declared. And so in my assessment, some of the work by environmental NGOs and the media is really putting pressure on governments in mainland Southeast Asia to act, many of which are authoritarian and unlikely to work to understand the concerns of impacted communities and include their participation in problem solving. So it seems to do exactly what my colleagues Ben Anderson and company have outlined in terms of reinforcing the status quo or existing power relations in some ways. So I think going forward for me, one of the key questions I have are about representation and who can actually declare a crisis. And with a range of overlapping crises being the current context for our world, I think that there are critical questions raised about the range of actors and what sorts of opportunities can be sort of taken or gained in this situation. And final slides, just I wanted to acknowledge that a lot of work went into this and funding, and I really appreciate all of those who took time to interview with me. And I put some selected references here if anyone is interested. It includes some co-authored publications. For instance, the work on migration that I presented today is co-authored paper with a PhD student of mine, Zali Foon. And thanks.
Thank you, Vanessa. That was really great. Thanks so much. I guess we would go perhaps directly now to Keith, and then yeah, we'll have time, of course, for Vanessa to respond to Keith, and then we'll open the floor for audience to ask questions. And I think Alexander, probably he had some connection issues, so I think he has now disappeared. So I'll try and with Ina maybe to chair that final discussion. But yeah, Keith.
Okay. Yep. Thanks, Vanessa. That was great. I could see how your work has been evolving and getting more detailed and more complex over the last maybe 5 years or so since you first started looking at this issue. So that's really interesting to see the ways in which it's going. I'll keep my comments very brief, and maybe, as always, you can always identify new things that someone could do, but are not necessarily within the scope of what can be done in a single project and things like that. But anyway, with that in mind, I'll just say a few points perhaps quickly. First, the things that came to my mind is how sand fits into the broader aggregate mining economy, I suppose. So sand along with gravel, crushed stone, it's sort of a certain type of the mining sector that has probably particular relations and attributes and uses and things like that. So perhaps putting sand within that sort of mining context could be interesting. And of course, when we do that, that also brings up for many people who study mining the issue of mining labor. So be interesting to hear who are these laborers who are mining the sand and what are some of the labor relations around that. Second point, just on that wide variation in trade data that you mentioned between 1.7 billion to 70 billion. That's a big variation there. And is that like sand, like international trade or the entire world economy of sand? I would, given how extensive it's used, I would imagine that probably the economy is towards the upper scale of that range. You know, even perhaps going through some of those, UNHS codes, harmonized codes for trading could give you some insights into the scale of the international trade anyway. And as always, it's usually good to use the data from countries that are more likely to accurately record imports as opposed to under recording exports like Singapore. The third point that sort of caught my mind was the idea of sand as scarce, which is a surprise to many people probably. But even, well, first of all, I was thinking that, economists love to frame things in terms of scarcity because that, of course, allows it to be commodified and to have a price put on it, right? So there's an economic process of making something a scarce resource, even when it's not necessarily scarce. But then also, of course, the issue of scarcity is really, scarce according to what price, right? So how much is something what's a competitive price for sand and who's going to buy it, right? So that brings up the idea of cheap sand, not just sand generally, but cheap sand. Where can sand be mined at a cheap price that can be sold to a buyer? And so that in turn then brings up issues of, extractable sand. Almost, I hate to bring up my favorite word, but frontiers of sand mining, right? How is sand being made a cheap resource? And it's no surprise that, the major areas of sand production are, countries like Myanmar, in which cheapening is an easier political and economic process to achieve. So that's interesting how sand then fits into sort of work around relational resource geography, bringing in ideas of value as well as and price into these issues. So that's a potential area of further work, I suppose. You also talked about the crisis narrative, which I think you well explained, and I buy that argument. I think on the one hand, people who study resource extraction in places like Southeast Asia and elsewhere, are concerned about the crises that we see in terms of the environmental and social impacts, but then are also concerned about simplified narratives that can be attached to these issues. And on that sense, I thought, you might have been doing this in your other work, but do you have a bit more to say on the simplified narratives that might be coming up? For someone who doesn't study this, it's not immediately apparent to me how, for example, in Singapore, how this issue is being talked about as a major importer. What sort of simplified narratives might be used in that context, or is it just sort of blocked narratives? Just discussion is being stifled and suppressed. And yeah, agreed on sand and migration. It's probably overdetermined and complex and not easy to trace singular causalities. That seems like an important point. And I guess maybe my last point will be talking about sort of how sand is mined, but also how through other forms of resource development, sand sort of accumulates in places. And maybe, I'm not sure if you've spoken about this, you might have already, but I can think of rivers in Laos, for example, where there's actually, too much sand because rivers have been diverted and there's erosion happening and villagers are being inundated by sand where there shouldn't be. So it's almost a question of sand out of place in that sense. Sand piling up behind reservoirs is another example of that, I suppose. So lots to talk about. I really liked your ethnography around life and livelihood around sand-based landscapes and how it links in with aspects of food production and migration and livelihoods. And so that was terrific. I learned a lot, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Keith. I'll just briefly respond and then is it okay?
Yeah.
See, Tim had a question that sort of actually ties into what Keith was saying, I think. I just want to say the labor part and maybe the accumulation part, but thanks for all the comments. The labor aspect I think is really interesting. It would be different depending on if you were like, I'm talking about this case in Pa'an, but just to be very straightforward, like it's different in Thailand and Cambodia. In this part of Myanmar, Burma, it was networks of people related to whoever had the sort of permit or contract for that stretch of the river. So in some cases it was the military, in some cases it was more related to like armed ethnic organizations, and they would use their own networks to employ laborers. So it wasn't really like local people would really be employed in sand mining once it got to like be sort of more formal. So that sort of meant that like people who had been doing it for like, you know, we're going to build this building over here and we're going to get paid as a day laborer to do this, or we're going to use it for ourselves. They kind of got pushed out of that economy. But I know in other contexts, it can actually be a way for people to make money. So I'm not trying to make a big claim about that, but that's this context. And I think the point about like how sand is mined and how it sort of accumulates in places, again, it speaks to like the geographical variation. So on the Saloween, it's like considered very fast, high sediment load river. And so with sand mining, there is like this falling off of banks near Pa'an, but like downstream near to Molamyai, there's like rapid sedimentation that's happening. And so some people, just an example that I interviewed, this was also like most recent in 2019, so this has definitely changed to the present, but they were happy about the increased sedimentation because for years they had been like having coastal erosion. So they were actually happy to have a bit more land to work with. So it's very uneven, right? Even within the same river system. And that community, I mean, you know, I could tell a whole other story about that community because coastal sand mining and coastal erosion, especially when you're in estuary like that, is really complex. But yeah, there's a lot more to talk about there. And maybe if it's okay, I'll address Timo's question in the chat. Hi, Timo. This is part, I cut this from the talk, so I'm happy for you having to ask me about this, but one of the reasons I chose originally to focus on Myanmar, I mean, there were a lot of reasons. One is that it was like just really in a field set I was already working was very like rampant all of a sudden. But I thought it was really interesting and important that with the 2014 farmland law in Myanmar, which again, because of the military coup, it's not really as relevant in the current context, but alluvial land was actually considered under the farmland law, like explicitly. So you could have formal like use rights or access rights to the alluvial lands in the river, which is something that I think it surprised me, I guess I would say. And so people that I interviewed, they were considering taking those land use certificates to it's like a court for the 2014 land law arbitration to sort of get compensation for the loss of those islands. But because historically in that area, what people would do is like, you know, the alluvial islands pop up and disappear over the years. Some of them stay for many years, but you know, it's not guaranteed. And they have a local lottery system where if you lost a piece of island land, for instance, you would then be put in the lotto for the next island that pops up. And you don't get a whole island, you get like a plot within an island. And so there's a lot more I could talk about, but there is like quite a, I would say, complex management system here around these islands that has existed for a long time. And with the rise of sand mining and sometimes essentially scooping out these islands, right, you have a real impact on those like local governance systems.
Okay, great. Now we have still some time for discussion. So I wonder, of course, you can use the chat, but also if anyone wants to comment or ask from the audience, you can raise your hand or just open the camera. And if there are anyone who wants to comment, I have some questions also in mind, but if okay, there's
I I unmuted
Yes,
myself
okay.
here. I'm happy to
Yes.
ask a question. Vanessa, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I'm zooming in here from Montreal, so it's a wonderful opportunity to share your research from around the world. So we're in same time zone. Vanessa, thanks for a great talk. I very much agree with your point on there is a big emphasis, maybe even too big, or at least disproportionately large emphasis on the environmental consequences of sand mining. One of the things, so I work in my group, we work in Africa, and one of the countries we visited recently was Rwanda. And one of the things that surprised me here was when we spoke to the miners and we looked at their activities. This is artisanal small scale mining, so people with shovels and buckets, no heavy equipment. But one of the things that surprised us was how how positive the miners actually were around sand mining. And that's not something I feel like we hear a lot in the literature. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that. Again, going back to this problematic nature around like the word using the crisis words and the environmental consequences, and also the examples you shared with your interviewees. But I'm curious about your thought on like the positive aspect, the laborers and the people involved in the mining in general, and their views on it from a more like, positive sense. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for that. I mean, I think there is like really wide variation in this, right? And I think it's worth noting that because, for instance, she's finishing up her PhD at York, Wendy Medina. She is working in a case in Indonesia, and it's sand mining is a real big part of the local economy, has been for a long time. People are very excited about the boom in interest in sand mining. As you said, there are some positive aspects, even if you want to think about like kinds of dirty jobs there are, like, you know, sand mining in a river system with, if it's artisanal, I'm thinking like the buckets and shovels, but also where I work, it can be like these rice barges that are retrofitted with like huge suction hoses sometimes, or, you know, there's a range of sort of tools. And so, yeah, I think compared to some other maybe like dirty jobs, I can see the positive. I think that's where like that sort of social political context plays a big role. So I think like, again, where I was working here, there wasn't really opportunities for locals to be miners in this way because of like the pretty strong ways that networks were used to get laborers. And it was usually like, if you're using these smaller boats, it's really like that person's social network or team that they've already decided they would come from somewhere else. They weren't local. In the case of, there's other kinds of sand mining that's not just like the sand, but if, for instance, like more specific silica mining, or minerals, it really depends too. Like I've seen cases in Saloween and Shan State where they're doing silica mining, and that was also like all from the outside, right? So it has a little bit more specialized equipment and so forth. You really want to get specific areas, whereas the part of the river I'm working at, they're kind of taking wholesale sands and gravels in many cases. So it's variable, and maybe, you know, this gets to part of maybe what Keith was suggesting, is that like there is a bit of room to disaggregate the sand economy further, right? In terms of like, you know, if we're comparing it to different mining sectors, like I do think that it can be hard to distinguish between, like, for instance, the sand for gravels and construction and fill. But, you know, I would say that it's pretty clear to distinguish between that and, for instance, sand for silica, sand for minerals, and so forth. It's just actually a whole set of different techniques and technologies, ships, and so forth. And I think that's worth disaggregating, right? You know, I've interviewed experts on the Irrawaddy, Saloween, and the Mekong for some of those more specific ones. It's a really different sort of operation. Anyway, yeah.
No, thank you. I think that's a good point, that we need to maybe distinguish it a bit more, not just talk about sand as being one thing. So yeah, thank you for that.
I can see at least 2 hands now there, Robert John and Ian Baird. So maybe we can combine them and then, or I mean that
Sure.
you before
Sure.
that Vanessa can wait for both and then address
Okay.
both at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks, Vanessa, for this very interesting talk. I wanted to ask about the resistance, because you talked about a range of resistance to sand mining, also of a range of actors and opportunities. My research is also taking place mainly in Cambodia, right, along the Mekong since 2016 on the sand mining, also having worked a lot with Mother Nature. And have seen the struggle they faced in resisting sand mining, also mobilizing local communities, giving the context that you just described with authoritarian governments pushing back. So what are these range of actors and opportunities that you see actually for resisting, especially in these settings that we said where governments might not be very open to listen to this conversations or pushed by civil society about crisis? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, great question. And Ian.
So I'm just wondering, maybe my question's quite a bit different. Maybe it would be better for Vanessa to respond to that first and then me go afterwards, because I'm gonna go in a very different direction.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, so thanks, Robert. I guess I was thinking like, so again, this is maybe depends on what context, because I know in Cambodia, I mean, you can literally be murdered for working on sand advocacy. So I will say maybe that was also part of my decision focusing on the case that I was, because I felt like it wasn't as hot as a political, so there was more room for both conversations about how to better manage the resource. And, you know, most of my work was taking place when everyone was really excited and we were building all these new draft policies for the Saloween and, you know, so it was a really different set of conversations. And so like we were looking at the time in terms of like multi-scalar ways that we could push for, you know, not just to have better strategies of governance for, you know, sand, but also like for increased participation for like Korean communities in terms of the decision-making process. So like that was a lot of that was subnational or municipal work. I mean, there was also federal, like a draft federal national set of suggestions on the Saloween. So like that was a different context than right now. So it's like I can speak to that and then today, but I will just say that when I was able to physically do the research, there were a lot of opportunities in that way. And people, like I said, were even trying to make solid claims for compensation using the land use certificates under the 2014 land law. Also, there were like smaller actions, like people using slingshots on riverbanks to sort of make the miners' lives more difficult. There was, I wouldn't say there was anything really resembling a protest. It was much more about like, let's organize a riverbank committee to sort of get our concerns heard at these different levels. And I think that was part of because everyone was really excited about this new way of doing governance in Myanmar at the time. I will say that like the issue though around Pa'an that I didn't research, which is like specific reasons why, is the cement mining. And so part of the reason I think Pa'an is very is experiencing this boom in sand is also because there's a lot of karsts that are being mined for cement. And that is being controlled by, like very heavily controlled by military and ethnic armed groups. And that comes into a bit more of these territorial disputes. And so like I didn't study cement intentionally, because that would have been more politically difficult. It's much more politically difficult to organize around. I think there's like 9 proposed factories in the region. There were 2 existing. And one of my colleagues, I mean, it's in the media, he was actually like, had to leave. This is before COVID and everything. He had to leave the country because of his work on the cement mining. So he organized a prayer ceremony around the river, around cement and extraction issues. And he actually then, he's living in Australia now. So, I mean, there's a range of ways that this becomes political in different contexts. And I'm not trying to pretend like there's one straightforward issue, but I will say now, you know, obviously people are still doing a lot of work on resource governance. There's a March 14th, a day of action on rivers that we see action, like people gathering in this area around the Salween Peace Park and so forth. But, you know, because of my lack of ability to do real research right now, I couldn't speak to as many of those options now. Like, it's definitely decreased. And especially that's because a lot of the work that was being put forth was towards this sort of governance structure, which unfortunately since 2021 and the military coup no longer really exists in the same way. Yeah. But there's great examples in
Thanks.
Indonesia. Sorry.
Yeah.
Well,
We
okay,
actually now, I mean, we kind of like set the time that we would be finishing now, but maybe we can go a little bit over time. But of course, if anyone feels like they need to go, so feel free. But yeah, so I'll hand over to Ian, and then yeah, I'm afraid that will be the last last comment from the audience now.
okay. Yeah, so I wanted to ask a little bit about I wanted to ask about what some things I've been seeing in the Mekong, and ask if you're seeing some similar things in the Salween that relate to Thailand's actions related to riverside embankments. Because a lot of people don't realize that Thailand's basically embanked almost the whole of the Mekong River right down along the border with Laos. And and as a result of this, they're not being hit so much by this erosion, even though they're very much involved in the sand mining, and it's hitting Laos more because Laos doesn't have the money to, you know, put in those embankments. And so there's some interesting, you know, some inequalities basically in terms of what different, and of course those embankments also cause their own impacts even within Thailand to look people that are doing like riverbank gardening, etc. So I'm just wondering if Thailand's also embanking the Salween, you know, in a similar way. And, you know, it seems, you know, there's kind of a little bit of a joke, which is more than just a joke, you know, where Thailand seems to be, this joke saying, well, Thailand's putting on these embankments so they can gradually gain territory over Laos, little by little, as it erodes into the Laos side, and then they build another embankment a little farther out. So I'm just wondering if this is a similar strategy that you're seeing along the Salween with the border with Myanmar.
Okay, that's really interesting. I will say that, like, according to some Facebook images that I saw in the last month, there's a stretch of the border that's sort of more controlled between Thailand and Myanmar, Burma. And there is like this public sort of set of picnic tables. I know it sounds funny, and an area where there would be a market like on the weekends. And that is interesting in the sense, I hadn't thought about it the way you spoke to it, but they are like concerned about flooding because the Salween is, you know, like monsoon floods. And so they have been talking about embanking that part of the river for a while now, around, you know, protecting people from flooding, and specifically protecting this area that the like government built, right, with picnic tables and some like areas where you could sell things. I don't think it's been done like yet, but it's just, it has been in the conversation, and that I hadn't thought of it the way you're saying. So I think it's completely possible, because that stretch has also been such a point of contention in terms of other projects, like the Hatchi Dam, like was found to have impacts that would cross the border and they couldn't control it. And so that sort of was part of the reason that in that case they were able to like the Human Rights Commission and so forth were able to sort of make claims that the original EIA was faulty. So there is something interesting there about that control aspect, but it's not there yet. Yeah.
Maybe we could talk about it some other time.
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, so yeah, I was thinking to ask if there, because in Cambodia there has been also these bans on sand mining on the coastal, but then previously on the river, and whether these kind of, I think also in one of your articles you mentioned that these regional interconnections are possibly are there, that it can then put pressure on if there is kind of like stricter ban somewhere. But in Cambodia, I mean, I don't know how effective the bans actually have been either. But I mean, but we can also, I guess we have to, these regional interconnections is an interesting theme, but we can discuss that later. Another other thing was also like how this disrupting in hydrosocial relations, how this fill-in part, because that's so relevant at the moment, for example, in Cambodia and around Phnom Penh, for example, if in Myanmar, like but maybe Salovin, it's perhaps because it's not so urban, it doesn't go through such kind of like maybe urban industrial areas, so that fill-in part of it, it's not necessarily so relevant if it's still more for the export. But yeah, but I guess we are now just, I don't know if any concluding thoughts would be difficult, but I guess just that I think it came very clear that alongside this partly problematic global crisis narrative, we definitely need these more situated studies and understanding, because as I think we quite clearly learned from Vanessa, and very nicely, I mean, that there are these very diverse kind of sand economies, and sand is in very different ways involved to hydrosocial relations in different parts of the world. So we definitely need these like multiple narratives alongside this one emerging crisis narrative. So thanks so much, and thank you everyone staying a little bit over time, and Keith especially, it's very late here in Canberra. I don't know if there is anyone else from this time zone there. I guess maybe I saw someone else there as well, but anyways, thanks everyone. And I think Sander would also still want to thank Vanessa and Keith as well, and everyone, and Ina also for helping in assisting in coordinating this, and I hope many of you will join the next EXALT dialogue as well. So, and there will be a recording, and this will be in the EXALT YouTube channel then later on, if you want to revisit this session. But thanks once more, everyone, and especially Keith and Vanessa.
Thanks for organizing. Thanks, Vanessa.
So I'll go, but thanks a lot, Mira, and I really appreciate it. And thanks to the other EXALT people too, Lena. Sorry, I know we haven't met.
Yeah,
but...
would be really great to talk more at some point.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I don't know when would that be possible, but